I actually thought for a while there, when there was talk of a possible meeting between Trump and Maduro, it was going to end up being like the Trump-Mamdani meeting. And, Trump would come out of it saying, Maduro, he's really not he's a really pretty good guy. He's a real
That could still happen, Rosa.
Okay.
Welcome to the Mona Charen Show. I'm delighted to have you with us today. And I am delighted also to welcome this week's guest. Rosa Brooks is professor of law at Georgetown University, where she specializes in international law and national security law, among many other things. I think she teaches an enormous number of different legal topics. She is also an adjunct senior fellow at West Point's Modern War Institute, and also a founder of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. Welcome, Rosa Brooks.
Hi, Mona. Thank you for having me on. I should say, by the way, that I think my stint at the Modern War Institute is over. And I emphasize that because I don't want to attract the attention of the he who cannot be named to West Point.
Yeah.
and decide a missile strike on West Point or something.
Yes, exactly.
I'm no longer affiliated with West Point. Don't be mean to them.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Thanks for that clarification. Before we get into drone strikes and other things this administration is doing and the legal implications of all of that, I saw in your bio that you served as a reserve police officer in the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. Tell us about that.
Yes, I did. I for almost 5 years. It was fascinating. DC has a kind of unusual program. In many places, volunteers just, answer the phones or help direct traffic. But DC volunteers can go through the entire police academy. You become a sworn law enforcement officer. They give you a badge and a gun. You have full arrest powers. You just do exactly what the paid police do, except you don't get paid. Which still kind of blows my mind every time I think about this, because when I first learned about this program, I was like, you're kidding me. I can just volunteer to be a police officer. Really? But yes, I went through the police academy. I did all those things, and I was assigned to the 7th district, which is, the southern part of Anacostia, a southern part of Ward 8. And I was a police officer. It was absolutely fascinating. I mean, it definitely showcased both all that is messed up with policing in America, but also all that is really quite amazing. So it was an incredible experience.
Okay, that is just incredibly fascinating. I mean, how many law professors are, volunteer police officers?
As a matter of fact. And I know the other one because he's a guy, he's in his late 70s, and I wrote a book about this. It's called, and I'll just now pitch my book, called Tangled Up in Blue, Policing the American City. And this nice guy, who teaches at a law school in California sent me an email and said, I read your book. I'm in my 70s. I'm an emeritus law professor, and I've decided I'm going to become a reserve police officer. And he went to the police academy, and he's now a reserve police officer. And I was like, oh my God, I hope it all works out. I hate taking responsibility for this.
So fascinating. So what is the thing that has stuck with you the most from that experience? And has it influenced your life, your teaching?
Yeah. A couple things stuck with it. One is, no surprise, urban policing involves some quite serious crime. There is really serious violent crime in Washington, D.C., as there is in every city, but a lot of it is just troubled people with poor conflict resolution skills, that in any given patrol shift, on average, probably 9 out of 10 of the calls that you get involve, people in an argument with each other, somebody who is overdosed, somebody who, their teenager hasn't come home and they're in a panic, but the teenager's just out with other teenagers being a teenager, and, fights between siblings, fights between spouses, domestic issues, a lot of drug issues, a lot of petty neighbor disputes. There was one of my favorites was a guy, got tired of the smell of marijuana in the, staircase of the apartment building. So he decided to use, pepper spray as an air freshener, which, didn't endear him to his neighbors, as you can
Amazingly
imagine.
enough, yeah.
Right. And we kind of said, you should consider buying some Febreze instead. There was the woman who went after her boyfriend with a snapping turtle when he was unfaithful. There was the
Wow.
guy who had been sexually assaulted by monkeys, or so he said. So most of it is it's stuff like that. It's people who are mentally disturbed or have substance abuse problems or just really sad lives, and that if anybody who thinks that it's all running around and stopping murders, there's a little of that. Although unfortunately, police are not very good at preventing murders; they're better at finding the murderer after the fact. I think that's one thing. Another thing that really stuck with me was the disconnect between policing practices and what lawyers think affects policing practices. I mean, I teach criminal procedure,
Yeah.
and we talk about things like the exclusionary rule. Like if you obtained evidence illegally, it'll be thrown out. And so you would think, I mean, the assumption lawyers make is that, okay, this is a deterrent, that if police know that this evidence will be thrown out and the bad guy won't go to jail, they'll have an incentive to play by the rules. The problem is that your average line level patrol officer never finds out what happens to the people they arrest. So if the case doesn't go forward, and a lot of cases in DC don't go forward because they involve really trivial issues, or there was some mistake, or the officer didn't, there was a Fourth Amendment violation. There's no feedback cycle. So it made me realize that a lot of what lawyers assume just doesn't work because there's kind of a broken communications link. Maybe it would be a disincentive new, but
That is fascinating. And of course, in the category of lawyers who don't understand this lack of a feedback loop, you have to include the 9 lawyers on the Supreme Court who
absolutely
put that into our law on the assumption that it would
right. And it's a
restrain
totally
police
logical
behavior.
assumption. It just,
Yeah.
and you could imagine police organizations where it would have that effect, but at least day to day here in DC, not so much. I mean, I think the only other big takeaway for me was that, and this should be obvious to people, police don't decide how to be police by and large. The whether it's the mayor, the city council, the courts, the voters, judge, that has much more effect on policing practices. And by and large, we get mad at police officers. We're like, why are you arresting people for these trivial things? Well, guess what? Because we voted for a bunch of people who criminalized these trivial things and who said, get your arrest rates up so we can look like we're solving crime. That's why, and that it's not that police organizations themselves have no responsibility in making policing better. They do, and training matters hugely and so forth, training, recruitment, but that so many of the problems with policing really aren't about police. They're about the system they work in, which they don't have a whole lot of control over. That's mostly voters and legislators and judges and prosecutors.
So I do really want to get to these international law matters, but this is so interesting. I just have to ask you one final thing. So you were there, you were serving for 5 years, you said?
Almost 5 years.
And you must have encountered many other officers during that time. In your experience, did you have the sense that the police were sort of contemptuous of people's rights and would do whatever they could get away with? Or did you feel like, no, they were pretty conscientious? Or maybe a combination?
Most people were quite conscientious. I think there were areas where the training was terrible. I think it's improved since then. I went through the police academy in 2016. But most officers, to the best of their ability and knowledge, did their best. I mean, police officers, like everybody else, they don't wake up in the morning and say, like, how can I violate someone's constitutional rights today? They wake up and they think, I want to do a good job. I want to protect the community. I want to make my department proud. I want to make my family proud. There are bullies who go into policing because they think it's cool to have a badge and a gun and boss people around. But most officers go into policing. Very often they were a crime victim, they had a family member, a close friend who was a crime victim, or they got involved in criminal activity as a kid and some officer was kind to them, and they feel like, well, that officer helped me go on the right path. I would have been in jail if
Wow.
this officer hadn't been kind to me. So, most of them are doing their best. I do think there's some pretty deep structural challenges that they face, one of which is just as I said, the amount of just sheer dysfunction, poverty, mental illness, and cops get very frustrated because you've got somebody who's in traffic waving a knife around and somebody calls 911 and the officer goes and the person's clearly out of their mind. And they bring them to the emergency psychiatric clinic and they get some medication and then they're back out doing the same thing the next day. And,
Yeah.
officers can feel like, I can't solve this problem with
Right,
policing.
right, right.
But no, most officers I really liked and respect the vast majority of my colleagues.
With the holidays upon us, all of us need a good night's sleep more than ever. And I am delighted to talk today a little bit about ghost bed. Did you know that 60% of people say they get too hot when they're trying to sleep and that it interferes with their sleep? I was kind of surprised at that. I personally get both hot and cold in the same night, which is a cool trick. But women of a certain age may understand. In any event, that's why it's really cool in all senses of the word that Ghost Bed has this technology that actually has a stay cool feature. We've tried it with the pillows and I love it. And my husband loves it so much that he stole one of them. It is a family run company that has a reputation for quality, comfort, and lasting value. Every mattress in the Ghost Bed collection is designed with premium materials and has this advanced cooling technology to help regulate your temperature all night long. And it actually works. Tested right here in my own home. This ProCore layer does actually stay cool all night. So you don't have to flip your pillow over looking for that cool spot. It stays cool. And Ghost Bed makes it easy to upgrade your entire sleep setup from cooling pillows and luxury bedding to adjustable bases. Every product is designed for long-lasting comfort and relaxation. Not only that, they give you a 101 night sleep trial and a 20-25-year warranty. Shipping is fast and free. Most orders arrive in 2 to 5 days, so better sleep is closer than you think. What about the prices? Cannot be beat. Every Ghost Bed product, from their mattresses to their pillows and bedding, is priced at up to 50% less than comparable beds. Ready to make it an even better deal? Head to ghostbed.com/Mona and use promo code Mona at checkout to get an extra 10% off on top of their already reduced prices. That's ghostbed.com/Mona and promo code Mona. Upgrade your sleep with Ghost Bed, the makers of the coolest beds in the world. Some exclusions apply. See site for details. Speaking of abuse of power, which you really didn't see very much on the DC police force, but we are certainly seeing it at the federal level now with this administration. As we speak, there have been about 22 strikes on boats in the Caribbean and in the Eastern Pacific. 87 people have been murdered by the United States military because they were criminals. Not because they are
Suspected
terrorists. Suspected, thank you. Suspected criminals. And right, so there has been no evidence presented about whether they were even criminals. They could have been fishermen for all we know. The administration hasn't clarified that. So let's talk about where this stands as a matter of law, both for domestic U.S. law and international law.
Yeah. Yeah.
So domestic U.S. law, legal or illegal?
So domestic U.S. law, law enforcement officers, police officers, Coast Guard, while they're undertaking law enforcement missions, you don't kill suspects just because you think they might be committing a crime. Even
You
if you
don't
think
say.
I mean, right. There are people selling drugs on street corners and, alleys in every city in the country and in every rural area in the country. And by and large, no, it is not okay if you're a police officer to just go hide somewhere and shoot them from a distance and kill them because you think that even if you're sure, even if you see them selling drugs, you just like,
Right.
no, you don't do that.
Right.
Partly
That's murder.
illegal. I mean, the Supreme Court has been crystal clear on this. Law enforcement officers can use lethal force against a suspect when that suspect poses an imminent threat of, death or serious bodily injury to the officer or to other people. That's it. And that means imminent. Imminent doesn't mean, well, we think that, they're going to sell these drugs and a month from now, somebody's going to die of an overdose. And imminent doesn't mean here's a murder, here's a serial killer. And if they get away, they'll probably continue to kill. Imminent means they're coming at you with a gun. They're going at someone else with a gun. The only possible alternative that you have is to use lethal force, including up to and including killing them. So as a domestic law matter, it's very, very clear.
And the U.S. military has rules as well, right, for the conduct of military operations. Now, there are preliminary problems with that too, because we are not in a war with these people they seem to think that by giving a name to something, by slapping a label on these people, calling them narco-terrorists, again, without any evidence, that right. somehow means that we're at war and therefore the rules of war apply. Right. But we're not in a war, are we?
In my opinion, there's no legal basis for calling this any kind of war, or, the legal term is armed conflict. And I think the overwhelming majority of military law experts agree with that. It's funny. I go back in time to September 11, 2001. Do you remember? I'm sure you remember this. President George W. Bush, at the time the first planes hit the World Trade Center, was at an elementary school, and he was reading books to a bunch of picture books to a bunch of little children. And he got made fun of. Remember, he had the book upside down and his photo up, and that was what most people remember about that. But here's what I remember about that. He had just declared, as the reason he was reading books to little kids on that particular morning is it was part of a campaign. The Bush administration just launched a campaign in which he gave a speech in which he said, we're in a war on illiteracy.
War on illiteracy. Yep.
We're in a war on illiteracy. And needless to say, nobody thought that meant that we were going to, kill illiterates.
Or bad teachers.
Right, or bad teachers, right? That we're going to, that the U.S. military is not going to have drone strikes on incompetent teachers or something as a means of carrying out the war. And it was a metaphor, obviously.
Yes.
And well before that, the metaphor of the war on drugs had been used, but it had been seen as a law enforcement issue. And you can sort of see the slippery slope, right? Because the 9/11 attacks were just this kind of like, oh my God, what is this, right? Because, boy, the level of death and destruction and financial harm was on a scale with war, clearly, no question about it. Almost 3,000 Americans and others were killed in the 9/11 attacks. But it wasn't a state, it wasn't an army, it was a bunch of guys they didn't have even guns, right? They had box cutters and they, repurposed. So everybody's heads were sort of exploding. Like, what's the right framework for responding to this? Is it a law enforcement framework? Is it war? And I actually think that was kind of a hard one. I don't think that was an easy issue. I think at the time a lot of sort of progressive lawyers were like, this is not war. It doesn't fit. It's law enforcement. And, you can't just call it a war and then just go do whatever you want. And this was made even murkier by the Bush administration starting out saying a bunch of dumb, inane stuff that didn't have any legal backing, like, they're unlawful combatants, which is kind of not a legal category. They don't, the Geneva Conventions don't apply. You remember that whole debate?
I do.
And that led to some pretty bad stuff. And eventually the Supreme Court kind of slapped them down a little bit and said, you don't just get to declare that there are a bunch of human beings who live in this zone where there's no process and there's no rights and there's no protections and you just kill them, even if, no matter what they're doing, there has to be some kind of, threshold for a process. But I think that's the sort of the slippery slope. You can see that slippery slope, right? Okay, well, if we're gonna call Al Qaeda, we're saying if we're in armed conflict with Al Qaeda, okay, you can make that argument that, there's a logic to that argument. You can make a coherent, principled argument about why the law of armed conflict should govern that. But then you start getting to drone strikes the Bush administration carried out, the Obama administration carried out, the Biden administration carried out, where the U.S. military was using drone strikes against suspected terrorists in countries with which we were not at war. And it started getting more and more squishy. The logic was getting more squishy because, well, who is this person? How do we know? There's no other branch of government other than the executive branch evaluating the evidence. So depending, is this murder? Is this lawful?
Let me push back on that slightly. Because though I completely agree, it was very murky. And I particularly remember the huge controversy in the Obama years when he actually droned an American citizen abroad.
Anwar al-Awlaki.
And yeah. But regarding just one branch of government, we did have an authorization for the use of military force that was passed by the Congress. And it was very broad, but that was Congress's decision, right? That anybody who was in
wasn't that broad. It was interpreted very broadly, and then Congress rolled
I remember
over
it being broad in the sense of, anybody who had anything to do with 9/11, who offered aid and comfort to them or anything along those lines was a reasonable target, and we were at war with those people. No?
But that's actually not that broad, right? That's actually fairly narrow. And there was an initial draft of this is the 2001 authorization to use military force that Congress passed. Initially, it was even broader. It was sort of like, we're at war with anybody we feel like being at war with, whatever. Go ahead.
All right.
It got narrowed to saying Al Qaeda or a nexus with the 9/11 attacks. Then successive administrations, including two Democratic administrations, use that as an authorization to use force against people and groups where the connection to either Al Qaeda or 9/11 was so tenuous as to probably be virtually non-existent. And everybody knew this, and it was a bit of a joke. And Congress knew it too, and Congress was both Republicans and Democrats were perpetually running around saying, oh, we need to revise this. This is, being used to do things that was never intended to do. They just couldn't, Congress was too busy kind of rolling over and playing dead to actually do anything about it. But I mean, I think here's the problem, right? You can see the problem, and it's a deep conceptual problem that has to do with the ways the world is changing and the ways in which threats can increasingly come from non-state actors and individuals, but have an impact that's sort of on the scale of the threats that used to come from states. It's really easy, if somebody's wearing a uniform, somebody's wearing a German Nazi uniform and they're pointing a gun at you, you're like, oh ho, aha, it's the Germans, we're at war with them. But what do you do when you have these groups that may or may not be financed in some direct or indirect way by a state, but aren't part of an organized, hierarchical, formal military, but they're really doing harm? I do think it's a genuine challenge. I don't think that it's inappropriate sometimes to apply an armed conflict framework, but I think what we have seen has been that it's gotten sort of more and more tenuous. And here's the problem with only the executive branch, right? That when George W. Bush and then Barack Obama and then Joe Biden were like, yes, these people are lawfully targetable under the law of war and there is an armed conflict. The legal reasoning was fairly transparent. And they said, well, we have evidence. We're not going to share it with you, but trust us. We're good guys. We would never do this without evidence. And here's the kind of evidence that we would require before we do this. And we've got these internal checks and balances. That always bothered me, right? It bothered me when Bush said it. It bothered me when Obama said it. It bothered me when Biden said it. And I worked for the Obama Defense Department during all this too. Because the problem is, although I did trust all of those administrations, not just to make stuff up, we meanwhile had Putin running around, murdering people with poisoned umbrellas, right? Saying the same exact thing. Saying, oh no, you think I just murdered a dissident. That's not true. This was a
A
combatant
terrorist.
or
Yeah.
terrorist, and I have
Yeah.
evidence and it's secret, and I don't have to tell you what it is.
No,
And we were like,
fair,
you can't do that. It's really
fair
hard to
enough.
respond to that. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
you
No.
get Trump saying, oh, these, you may think they're fishermen. Well, I think they're narco terrorists, and I don't have to tell you why I think that. And I don't have to have anybody ever take a look at it and say, did you make a mistake? Did you lie? Whatever. And I sure
Right.
don't trust him
No,
any more
I
than I
see your
trusted
point
Vladimir Putin.
completely. Yes, that's point well taken. But I would hasten to point out that there is a world of difference between the murky areas that we got into going after groups that had come at us that had bombed two of our embassies in Africa, that had attacked us on 9/11.
100%.
And using the same logic to go after people who are at the very worst, right? Trying to put
Smuggling
drugs in the market that people will
Yeah.
purchase and take. This is
Right.
not coming at you
Yes.
with a gun or a missile or an airplane that you have
Yeah.
repurposed to be a flying bomb.
Totally agree. Totally agree. I mean, I think the kind of legal logic, it's what enables them to make this claim, these sort of ever more far-fetched claims. And this is always a problem in the law, right? That you can always sort of say, well, okay, what if this? What if that? What if this? What if it's a little bit more distant? Well, what if it's even a little more distant? Well, if it's somebody who was a terrorist financier. So the Obama administration, the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, by the Obama administration in a drone strike. The argument was not that he was carrying a bunch of bombs and he was about to go blow up an embassy. The argument was that he was a propagandist and a recruiter and part of a financial network. And that if we didn't kill him, that, eventually his actions had indirectly and would indirectly eventually lead somebody else to pick up a bomb and go to an embassy or whatever it might be. And you can see how then, well, why shouldn't, I don't think Donald Trump is troubling his pretty little head with these details, much less Pete Hegseth, right? But you can see how if you're a lawyer and you just want to do what Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump want you to do, you could be like, well, why shouldn't I say that these guys, okay, no, they're not going to kill anybody right now, but they're part of a network that are going to get these drugs that are eventually going to kill some Americans. And besides, the money that they make selling these drugs might eventually indirectly finance some terrorists. And like, well, really, what's the difference? It's a difference in degree, not in kind. And that's I think it's a completely morally bankrupt argument,
Right.
but that's where they're coming from, obviously.
So there's been a huge amount of attention on this so-called double tap, which many people are saying is a war crime, namely that they blew up the boat. There were two survivors, and there's been, and then they hit it again and killed those two people. That is grotesque, and it is hard to believe that this is being done in our name. But correct me if I'm wrong, the initial strikes seem to me to be completely outrageous and a war crime too, right? Because, well, maybe not a war crime, but a crime.
Right.
Because we have no business shooting people out of the water in the first place.
And I think that's the key issue that the media have often lost sight of, that it's horrific to kill these two guys who are desperately clinging to the wreckage of the boat, who are, frankly, probably going to drown anyway.
Right.
If it was a war, it would be a war crime. But if it's not an armed conflict in the first place, then the first strike, the issue is not the double tap. The issue's they said there were 11 people on that particular boat. All of them died. The first 9 died, presumably in the first strike. The last 2 died in the second, quote unquote, double tap strike. But the first strike that kills the 9 is no less a murder than the second strike that kills the other 2. I think even if for the sake of the argument, you agreed that there is an armed conflict framework here, the killing of the final 2 is a war crime. But it's, I don't think it's just not. It's just, this is governed by the law that governs law enforcement activities. And both under U.S. law and under international law, that's just murder. I don't know if you've seen, there's a really revealing, letter sent by the, acting commandant of the Coast Guard, to Senator Rand Paul back in late October in response to a query about Coast Guard law enforcement interdiction of drug smugglers. And it's super revealing because it shows the sort of total bankruptcy of the arguments that, well, we have to use this lethal military force. The Coast Guard, one of the things he wrote, and they during a period of about a year leading up to when he wrote this letter, Coast Guard interdicted 212 suspected drug smuggling vessels. I'm looking at this letter here. And interestingly, I mean, a couple of things that stand out about this to me. One of those is the 212 interdictions. The Coast Guard did not have to use lethal force against any of them. 41 of them turned out not to have any contraband on board. That's a high percentage. Turned out they thought they were drug smugglers. Turned out they weren't. Right. And if you just blown them out of the water, you would have blown a bunch of fishermen out of the water.
And there is a Colombian fisherman who I believe has filed, his family has filed suit because they say he was just a fisherman and the U.S. murdered him.
That's exactly right. And I think that, the broader point is that the Coast Guard actually had a really successful year. They interdicted a lot of drug smuggling boats. They seized a lot of drugs. They did it without having to kill anybody. I mean, you don't need to fire missiles if what you're worried about, if you're genuinely worried, as you should be, as we should be, right, about drugs coming into the U.S., fentanyl not actually coming from Venezuela as far as we can tell primarily, but whatever, but whatever you're worried about, the Coast Guard actually does a fantastic job at stopping these boats, seizing the cargo, and putting these guys on trial.
Right.
Which is the way we should do it. There's among other things, even leaving aside the kind of totally spurious fake arguments for, but this is actually a war of some sort. Coast Guard was doing just fine. And they didn't need to kill anybody. This is completely unnecessary.
So there's a guy named Rodrigo Duterte who's currently on trial at The Hague for crimes against humanity. He was the president of the Philippines in Trump's first term and partly into Biden's. And Trump was always so impressed with Mr. Duterte.
He was. He loved him.
Not
as
him
many
some
shoes
Duterte.
As the Marcoses, but
Yeah, right. And what he loved was that Duterte was a tough guy who really went after those drug smugglers. Well, in fact, what Duterte did was engage in a massive extrajudicial killing spree where he just sent out his goons to kill anybody they thought or suspected might have something to do with drugs or anybody they wanted, frankly, because when you give people that kind of discretion, there's going to be mistakes and there's going to be abuse and they're going to also kill the guy they owe money to and God only knows what.
Right.
And so there were thousands upon thousands of Filipinos who were murdered by the Duterte regime. And that guy is the one that Trump was constantly praising. He has also revealed what's in his head, I think, many other times, like this fantasy that he has, for example, that China has no drug problem because they just kill drug dealers. So this is completely absurd. China does have a big drug problem. They do kill people in China, of course, but that's hardly a recommendation for American policy. They don't have a particularly robust justice system there. And anyway, that gives us a sense of Trump's idea that, and people always said, oh, don't take Trump literally, take him seriously. The fact is, he has told us time and time again what he admires, what he wants to do, and he is doing it now.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing you can't accuse Donald Trump of is hypocrisy. I suppose. Although, boy, do I miss political hypocrites right now, honestly.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. All right. There is a tiny glimmer of hope, Rosa, this week. I mean, it's really tiny, but let's mention it. Yeah. The Senate is threatening to withhold 25% of Pete Hegseth's travel budget if he doesn't release the video, which, by the way, about that video, the senators want it released, including Republican senators. Trump was asked about it a few days ago and said, yeah, he had no problem having it released. Then a couple of days after that, he's asked about it, and he denies that. It calls the reporter a liar. He denies that he ever said that. But anyway, they are threatening. There's an NDAA, National Defense Authorization, that they've tucked in this little thing about withholding 25% of his travel budget if he doesn't release the video. Is that a tiny little spine? A tiny little growth?
It'd be better if they threatened to reduce his, his hair gel funding by 25%, Pete Hegseth, honestly. But I don't know if he cares about his travel budget. But yeah, there's some tiny little signs that Republicans in Congress are maybe thinking possibly eventually about being a little bit less supine than they have been recently. As you know, I hope it sticks. I'm not super confident. I mean, there are Republicans in Congress, in the Senate in particular, who used to care about this kind of thing. And in the last year, they've shown no particular evidence of any willingness to stand up for congressional prerogatives. Which is a real shame. I mean, this is, the irony. I mean, I say, well, one of the things that always bothered me about this kind of drone strike in this sort of murky area where it's a little unclear whether and how the law of armed conflict applies has been, you've got just one branch and there's sort of no checks and balances. Well, of course, you can have whatever structural checks and balances you want, but if you've got Congress who's just not interested in doing its job, and or the judiciary is not interested in doing its job, it doesn't matter if on paper they've got authority. And I sure would like to see Congress wake up a little bit. It's interesting. I do think that obviously what do members of Congress respond to? Well, and I think this has been said many times, got to get to the moment where they're more scared of their voters than they are of Trump. The polls suggest that even a lot of Trump voters are having real qualms, and thinking, wait a minute, this is not quite what I wanted. I didn't think he would do these things. And maybe that's giving members of Congress a little bit more spine. I'd like to think so. Yeah.
So the only reason they fear Trump is that they fear Trump's ability to convince their voters of one thing or another. And it does feel, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, and I don't want, they always say it's the hope that kills you. So, don't want to assume too much here. But the fact is, Trump is now rolling out that traditional playbook, when it comes to the thing that is dragging him down with voters, namely the price of everything, the cost of living, which was so damaged Biden and is now damaging Trump. Mm-hmm. And he's rolling out the old playbook of, this is a Democratic hoax. Mm-hmm. And there's just a little tickle in the back of my mind that's thinking, so people know that it's not a hoax because they go to the supermarket every week and they pay their rent and all the other bills. And will some of them say, he also said that the Russia thing was a hoax. And he also said that the 2020 election was stolen. Maybe he's not such a reliable, anyway, whatever.
And right. I mean, this is the great mystery of Donald Trump to me. I mean, I grew up in New York where Trump was, of course, famous as a con man. Right. And he was a joke.
Absolutely.
He was a joke and a con man. And
I grew up in New Jersey, and same,
right.
We knew about Trump the con man.
And so for me, it's one of the great mysteries of life has been, how can so many Americans look at this man and apparently think, this guy's on the level, this guy's going to fight for me and my interests, and not just see what I see when I just see, this guy doesn't care about you. This guy has nothing but contempt for you. This guy will say whatever he feels like saying. And that the only mystery that's even deeper than that has been, why are so many rich and powerful people, whether in Congress or, Wall Street folks, so scared of him? I keep waiting for the emperor has no clothes moment, when people kind of go, wait a minute, this guy's just a charlatan. He's not a conservative. He's not an anything. He's just a con man.
Yeah,
That is all
I
he
gave up
is.
years ago hoping for that moment. I don't
Yeah.
think that will ever come, partly because people are much more reluctant to
Yes.
admit that they've been
Right.
conned than they are to be conned in the first place. And
Yeah.
so
No,
there's
that's right.
too
The
much of a
pride
sunk
invested.
cost there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But let's just spend a few minutes, if we can, on the other thing that the administration did this week, which is they put out this national security strategy,
Mm.
which just reeks of Trump on every page. And, well, of course, that practically mentions Trump on every page. It is such a gift to Vladimir Putin, right? I mean, he doesn't say anything about Russian aggression. It says that they want to, for example, end the perception and prevent the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance, right? You can see Putin saying, "Lovely," right? I mean, and they say the days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. And then, Rosa, there's a lot of language in here which is right up to the line. It's probably over the line of this kind of white nationalist,
Yeah.
you know, white genocide talk.
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah.
think?
I mean, it's no more outrageous than quite a lot of the documents this administration has put out, and no more self-centered than Trump self-centered. I mean, free national park admission on his birthday, but he's canceling any free admission on, MLK Day. I'm like,
Yes. I mean,
my
just
God.
unbelievable.
Just the level
Yeah, and
of
he's put his name on the U.S. Institute for Peace.
the level of egomania is just stunning, and so
I know. Oh, and back to our conversation just a second ago. This is the kind of thing too, where you really, I mean, people like us just spend
right,
our time sort of racking our brains thinking, if ordinary voters who voted
right,
for him came across anybody else in their life who behaved like
who
this,
acted like
they would
that.
say this person is mentally ill. There's something wrong with
Yeah,
him.
100%. Right. Like yes, insane. It's a deep and abiding mystery.
It
But,
is. It
but
is.
yes, this is very bad. There are lots of really serious threats in the world. China's growing military and technological edge over the United States is one of them. Russia's aggression, unbridled aggression is one of them. Onslaught against basically Western civilization defined as, like, as you say, it's like borderline white nationalist craziness. That is not actually a threat. Like, what? It's depressing and sad, and it focuses us on all of, on a bunch of things that range from minor threats to non-existent and really dangerous, fake threats, and it ignores the actual threats. And this is well, actually, here's a question I have for you, Mona, because here's another mystery. The whole boat strikes, the boat strikes, that Trump is now making noises about, can't even rule out ground troops in Venezuela. I'm like, what? What? Huh? I don't think he's actually going to use ground troops in Venezuela, because I actually do think he is a chicken hawk, and is terrified of getting the U.S. embroiled in some kind of ground war. But I do think it seems possible, indeed likely, that there will be some kind of airstrikes, drone strikes on Venezuelan soil. I don't get it, though. Like, whose interests is this serving other than maybe Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth? I mean, Trump doesn't care about Venezuela. Trump doesn't really care about anything, obviously. The
Building
MAGA
his ballroom.
building his ballroom, right? And he can,
Yeah.
whatever. I don't care. Like, I
Yeah.
don't care. He wants to knock down the whole White House and build a giant tower made of gold with his face on it. Like, I don't really care, frankly. I mean, that's like the least of our problems, but like, the MAGA base is not particularly enthusiastic about foreign military adventures.
It is
Who,
odd.
what
It is odd,
constituency?
especially when he's obviously panting after a Nobel Peace Prize and keeps
Right,
claiming that he has solved 8 wars, made
right,
peace in 8,
right.
which is ridiculous. I mean, there were some
But so
ceasefires, which
why
is
do you
not
think
peace,
they
but
think this is so important? Like who did they, I mean, I get that everybody keeps saying, well, wag the dog, Epstein is a distraction, but if you're going to have a
uh,
nice distraction, do something that your voters are going to love, not something your
yeah.
voters are going to be like, huh?
Yeah, the only sense that I can make of it, and this isn't much, is that he does have, and it's reflected in this national security strategy statement, which is he does want to withdraw from most of the world as hegemon, but he still wants to be the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. And he's got designs on Greenland, and he talks about annexing Canada, and it's the Gulf of America, and we can do whatever
Mhm.
we want in our hemisphere. And by the way, the Russians and the Chinese, they can have
They
their
can do whatever
spheres
what
of
they want in
influence.
their hemisphere. How many hemispheres
Uh,
are there anyway?
yeah. And so that's the only sense that I can make of it, which is that,
Yeah.
he just feels like this is our little playground. It's kind of a throwback to the gunboat diplomacy days of the 19th
Right.
century. But you're right. I mean, the MAGA base is not going to like that if he does actually engage in conflict. If he lobs a few bombs
Right.
and is
Then
lucky enough to
whatever.
hit, Maduro with one of them, maybe they'll be okay with that. Though by the way, I mean, even though I think Maduro is one of the worst
Absolutely.
dictators on the planet
Yeah.
who has destroyed his country, nevertheless, I don't have any confidence that that makes any sense whatsoever as a geostrategic matter. I mean,
Right.
who's going to
Right.
take over after Maduro?
Right.
One of his corrupt generals, right?
Right.
How is that good for us?
It's just it's strange because there are many things that the Trump administration does where I don't like it, but I can see the logic behind their doing it from their perspective. And this one, I just think, huh?
Yeah.
What? It's just Pete
Yeah.
Hegseth. It makes him feel tough. I mean, maybe. But then again, I actually thought for a while there when there was talk of a possible meeting between Trump and Maduro, it was going to end up being like the Trump Mamdani meeting. And, Trump would come out of it saying, Maduro, he's really not he's a really pretty good guy. He's a real,
That could still happen, Rosa.
okay, whatever.
I mean, let's not forget the first term, he went on this fire and brimstone series of threats against North
right,
Korea.
right.
So,
And then, right, then it's a bunch of love letters.
yeah. So who knows? I mean, that
And I'm
might
sure
be in the
Maduro
cards.
is thinking like, can I send him, how do you send flowers to the White House?
Yeah.
I'm sure,
Oh, no, they've upped the ante. In the second term, you have to send a jet, like
yes, the second
Qatar.
time you just have to send cash. I'm sure Maduro's like, do you guys take
Cash,
credit cards?
gold.
You know what? This is what bothers me most, Mona. I have to say this. I shouldn't say this is what bothers me. Not really, but I feel a little bit like it's so embarrassing right now to be an American. Like if we're gonna have if we're gonna descend into totalitarianism or something, like could we have a classier dictator? I mean, can you see Chairman Mao saying "quiet piggy" to a reporter?
Oh,
Really? Could we just have a less embarrassing guy?
yeah. And the really sort of pathological narcissism,
Yeah.
this constant references to himself, my birthday
Right.
and
Right.
putting his
Right.
name on everything, and it's going to be the
Yeah.
Donald J. Trump ballroom, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is also just
Now, a
deeply,
classier
deeply
dictator would
embarrassing.
let his obsequious minions name stuff after him, and then he would sort of
Right,
modestly
that's
say,
right.
"Oh, little old me. Well, that's awfully nice of you." But Trump's
Yes.
just like
Oh,
so embarrassing.
agreed. Let's see. There was one more thing that I wanted to talk about, and that is this national security strategy document seems to, again, this is pure Trumpism. They seem much more offended at the idea that China wants to sell us things. and that then that China is building up its military and it's expanding its threat to us militarily and to its neighbors militarily. And I don't think this even is mentioned, but China has been a key backstop to Russia in its war against Ukraine. But they're not offended by any of that. What offends them is if they try to sell us products that are too cheap.
I know, because Americans really hate cheap consumer products, especially at the holidays.
Yes, yes. We all hate Walmart and Costco, and
Right.
actually, Costco gets very few of its products from China. I was just reading. I love Costco. I'm one of those. Apparently, Costco. One of the reasons that they felt bold enough to sue the administration over the tariff issue, which they just did last week, is that they have many superpowers, but one of them is they have tremendous brand loyalty from their customer base.
Interesting. I never
And
got into
I am
Costco.
one of them. I love
One of
that.
them. Yeah, maybe I
Yes,
should
I
do
love
Costco.
them.
I was
It's,
always kind of intimidated by it, but maybe I should get into
oh,
the Costco cult.
I am definitely a cult member. But anyway, yeah. So they get only a small
Well,
percentage of their
that's what
products from
Trump,
China.
I mean, Trump is interested in money. That's the language he speaks. It's a language, it's about money, it's about personal enrichment, it's about enrichment for his friends and his family members. He kind of gets money in a way that he doesn't get anything else. That's the only,
I'll
you
say
know,
one other
America
thing one other little tiny glimmer of hope that I am permitting myself, which is that a lot of the Trump voters really did buy into this idea that Trump, because he was so wealthy, was incorruptible. And that I can't tell you how many hate letters I've received over the years where people have said, you used to be a good Republican and now your brain you've got Trump derangement syndrome. Don't you realize that Trump isn't even taking a salary as president? He is doing this all for us. And anyway, so here's the tiny little glimmer of hope, which is he's making it pretty damn obvious now that it's all about him and all about his personal enrichment and that of his family. And some of those people, I may even notice that he's like
maybe, yeah.
the most corrupt president in the history of the country. And we had a Gilded Age.
Maybe. I hope so. I think that the problem is that a lot of right. To me, some of the personal enrichment deals are just so blatant. But I'm not sure what gets through to people, right? I'm talking to you from rural Wyoming, Bighorn County, Wyoming. This is not Jackson. This is 5 hours away from Jackson. This is one of the reddest counties in the reddest state in the country. And so a lot of my neighbors here are big Trump supporters, and they're lovely people. And they're not dummies.
Right.
But if they're watching any TV, they're not reading the newspaper by and large. They're watching TV at all. They're watching Fox. Many of them are not even doing that. They're just getting their information from, social
Their
media
phones.
and so on. And yeah. And, I'm sure you do the same thing just out of, masochistic curiosity every day. I kind of take a quick look, oh, how's Fox playing this and so on. And, and that's not even getting into the sort of darkest depths of the magosphere. And so stories that are front page stories on the New York Times and the Post and the top headlines on CNN and ABC and CBS and whatever we're supposed to call whatever used to be MSNBC, if can't remember.
MS Now.
MS Now, right? I always think of like Ms. Now, like Ms. Pac-Man, but whatever. They're just not even mentioned on Fox. It's like they don't exist. And
Right.
so it's, tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it. If you engage in the most corrupt practices of any president ever, but your voters never hear about it.
Well,
So that's the challenge that those
that
information.
is the challenge.
So,
That is the challenge. By the way, I was in Wyoming just over the summer, and it is glorious, but I was closer to Jackson. I was in the Grand Tetons. And it's magnificent. And I know it is a super red state. They were unwise enough to jettison Liz Cheney, but there are less than 500,000 people in the entire state.
Well, and here's my glimmer of hope, is that well, two glimmers of hope. One is that I don't think Americans have gotten any crazier or meaner than they ever were.
I agree.
The vast majority of my Trump voting friends and neighbors here are nice, normal, decent people. I think they've been, fed a line. But I don't think they're, horrible white supremacists who, I just don't.
Yeah.
There are people like that, no question.
Oh,
I
of
don't
course.
think the majority of
And they're
Trump
all
voters-
on Twitter.
and they're all on Twitter and whatever. But that's one thing is that I feel like, most Americans are still not super informed sometimes, but, decent human beings. They've always been. The second thing that gives me a slight glimmer of hope is the number of people here who I meet who are lifelong Republicans and who are just horrified by what Trump is doing. And, the leader of the local resistance, if you will, I hate that term. It seems so goofy, but, is a guy, who organized a group called the Concerned Citizens of Bighorn County. And he is a, lifelong Republican, retired Republican state court judge. And many of the people involved in that group who were turning out for No Kings protests and, trying to go to town halls and writing letters to the editor, these are not a bunch of inside the Beltway elites, and these are not a bunch of, woke liberals. These are people, ranchers, they're railroad workers, they're oil and gas workers, they're, teachers, they're electricians who are saying, this is not okay. This is not normal. This is not okay. This is not what America is supposed to be about. And they are, they have been kind of activated. And that gives me a lot of hope that because it's, it's easy for somebody to dismiss me or you, we're these like elites, whatever. But it's much harder to dismiss your neighbor, the rancher who's lived there his whole life, or the, the local wrestling coach, and judge who've been there, who are your neighbors, who are serious people. It's just much harder to dismiss those. And I do think that kind of those cracks are growing as you see more and more people just saying, not okay, not okay, not what I voted for, not what I would vote for, not what I want, not what you should vote for.
So reality is breaking through.
I hope.
Yeah, me too. That's a great note on which to end. Thank you, Rosa Brooks, for joining me. It's been really fascinating conversation.